Sometimes the heart finds what it needs in the most unexpected places. We all know that feeling, when life has worn us down to the bone and we've given up believing in second chances or finding someone who truly sees us. Ruth Calder lived alone in the Wyoming mountains, trading pelts and keeping to herself after too many disappointments. She went to town looking for a hired hand to help with winter supplies. Instead, she found a broken cowboy being sold at auction to pay debts that weren't even his. Most folks saw weakness. Ruth saw something different, a man who'd been knocked down but wasn't beaten. She bought him with her last coins, thinking she was getting help for the harsh winter ahead. What she discovered was that sometimes when you rescue someone, they rescue you right back. But when two people carrying deep wounds try to build something together, will their past pain tear them apart, or can they find the love they both stopped believing in? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust of Millerville had barely settled on Ruth Calder's boots when she felt the weight of every stair following her down Main Street. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who'd learned to depend on no one but herself. Her weathered hands steady on the reins of her pack mule, her grey eyes scanning the crowd with the wariness of someone who'd been burned before. She hadn't come to town for company or conversation. The approaching winter promised to be harsh. She could feel it in her bones, the way her grandmother always claimed she could. And her cabin high in the Tetons needed supplies that couldn't be trapped, hunted or gathered from the mountain's grudging bounty. Salt, flour, ammunition, and if luck favored her, a strong back to help haul it all up the treacherous passes before the first real snow made the journey impossible. The debtors' roundup, as the locals called it, happened twice a year in the town square. Men who couldn't pay their gambling debts, their bar tabs, or the money they owed to shopkeepers found themselves bound and auctioned off for manual labor. Ruth had hired men this way before, usually drunk cowboys who sobered up quick when faced with her mountain and her expectations. They worked hard for a month or two, earned their keep, and disappeared back to whatever saloon or card game had landed them in debt in the first place. But as she approached the wooden platform where three men stood waiting for buyers, Ruth's attention caught on something that made her pause. The first two were familiar types, weathered faces slack with drink and resignation, shoulders slumped in the posture of men who'd made peace with their own failures. The third man was different. He stood straighter than the others, despite the rope binding his wrists, his sun-darkened skin stretched tight over lean muscle that spoke of honest work rather than bar-room brawls. His dark hair fell across his forehead, partially hiding eyes that seemed to look past the crowd, past the humiliation, toward some distant point only he could see. When the auctioneer's gavel struck and the bidding began for the first man, this stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't lower his gaze. Ruth found herself studying the line of his profile, the way his chest rose and fell with controlled breathing, the calluses visible on his bound hands. There was something in his bearing that reminded her of a wild horse she'd once tried to gentle. Proud, hurt, but not broken. Not yet. Next up we got James Morrison, the auctioneer called, his voice carrying the practiced disinterest of a man who'd sold everything from cattle to conscience. Owes $300 to various establishments. Strong back, good with livestock, can read and write. What am I bid? The crowd's response was lukewarm. A few ranchers called out tentative offers. $20, $25. Ruth watched as James Morrison's hands clenched within their bindings, a muscle working in his jaw as his dignity was measured in coins and found wanting. Come now, folks, the auctioneer pressed. Look at them shoulders. This one's got some miles left in him. An older man in a stained vest laughed. Shoulders don't mean much if he's fool enough to owe half the town money. $30, called a woman Ruth recognized as the owner of the town's boarding house. Could use someone to haul wash water. Ruth's own voice surprised her. 50. The crowd turned to look at her, and she felt the familiar weight of their judgment, the strange mountain woman who lived alone and traded pelts like a man, who could outshoot most of the cowboys in 3 counties and had the unsettling habit of looking people straight in the eye when she spoke. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose. $50 from Miss Calder. Do I hear 60? Silence stretched across the square. $50 was more than most men earned in 2 months of honest work. It was certainly more than anyone expected to pay for a debtor's services, sold to Miss Calder for $50. The gavel struck with finality. As the crowd began to disperse, Ruth approached the platform where James Morrison waited. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself despite his bound state. When their eyes met, she saw something there that made her throat tighten, a flicker of gratitude mixed with a wariness that matched her own. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated man. "I appreciate your—" "Don't!" Ruth cut him off, pulling a worn leather pouch from her coat. "We'll settle the terms on the trail." She counted out 50 silver dollars into the auctioneer's palm, each coin representing weeks of careful saving and hard-won pelts. Her last silver dollar caught the afternoon light as it fell, and for a moment she wondered if she'd lost her mind. Entirely, the auctioneer handed her the papers as a bill of sale that made her stomach turn and gestured toward James. "He's yours for 6 months or until the debt's worked off. Whichever comes first." Ruth nodded curtly and produced a length of rope from her pack. James's eyes hardened as she approached. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I gave my word I'd work for whoever bought my contract." "The rope's not for running," Ruth replied, looping it around his bound wrists in a way that would allow him to ride but not escape. "It's so folks know you're spoken for. Last thing either of us needs is trouble from some cowboy with too much whiskey and not enough sense." Something shifted in James's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the faint beginning of respect. The ride out of town was conducted in silence, Ruth leading her pack mule while James rode her spare horse, an aging mare named Patience who'd carried many a hired hand up the mountain passes. Ruth had expected questions, maybe protests or attempts at conversation. Instead, James rode quietly, his eyes taking in the landscape with the attention of a man who understood that details might mean the difference between life and death in country like this. It wasn't until they'd climbed above the tree line, where the air grew thin and the peaks stretched endlessly toward a sky the color of old pewter, that he finally spoke. Why? The single word carried more weight than any speech. Ruth considered her answer as Patience picked her way along a narrow ledge, loose stones rattling down into the valley far below. She could have told him about needing help with the winter supplies, about the practical necessity of strong shoulders and a willing back. Instead, she found herself speaking a truth she hadn't planned to share. "Because you looked like you still had fight left in you." James was quiet for so long that Ruth began to think he wouldn't respond. Then, as they crested a ridge and her cabin came into view, a sturdy log structure tucked against the mountainside like a secret, he said, "Most days, I'm not so sure about that." Ruth's cabin sat in a natural hollow, protected from the worst winds, with a clear spring running nearby and a view that stretched for miles across the valley below. She'd built it herself after her father's death 5 years ago. Every log notched and fitted with her own hands, every stone in the hearth carefully selected and placed. It was small but solid, designed for one person who valued solitude above comfort and function above appearance. As they approached, Ruth felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. She'd never brought anyone to this place, never shared the space that had become her sanctuary from a world that had disappointed her too many times. The cabin held her private life. Her books, her sketches, the worn leather journal where she recorded her thoughts and dreams alongside practical notes about weather and game sign. "You can stable your horse in the lean-to," she told James, dismounting and beginning to unload her pack mule. "There's hay and grain, water from the spring." James slid down from Patience's back and began loosening the cinch without being asked. Ruth watched from the corner of her eye as he ran experienced hands along the mare's legs, checking for heat or swelling. His movements economical and sure. You know horses, she observed. I used to. The words carried the weight of a life left behind. Ruth hefted a bag of flour over her shoulder and headed for the cabin door. Well, these two aren't much to look at, but they're steady. Patience will carry you anywhere you need to go. And stubborn, that's the mule, lives up to his name, but he'll haul twice his weight without complaint. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the familiar comfort of her home. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, dominated by a large stone fireplace and furnished with pieces she'd built herself: a table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books, and the few treasures she'd accumulated over the years. A ladder led to a sleeping loft under the peaked roof, and a smaller room to the side held her supplies and the tools of her trade. James appeared in the doorway, still carrying the rope that bound his wrists, and Ruth realized she'd forgotten about his restraints in her absorption with homecoming. "Lord," she muttered, setting down the flour. "Here I am acting like you're a guest instead of—" She stopped, not wanting to finish the sentence. "Instead of property you bought fair and square," James supplied quietly. Ruth met his eyes. "You're not property. You're a man who owes a debt, and I'm a woman who needs help getting ready for winter. Nothing more complicated than that." She pulled out her knife and cut the rope from his wrists, noting the raw marks where the bindings had chafed. "There's salve in the kitchen cupboard if you need it. And there's beans and salt pork for supper if you're hungry." James rubbed his freed wrists, flexing his fingers. "Thank you." Ruth turned away, busying herself with unloading supplies. "Your sleeping quarters are in the lean-to. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. We'll start work tomorrow. There's a lot to do before the snow flies. And winter comes early up here, as evening settled over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Ruth found herself stealing glances at the stranger she'd brought into her carefully ordered world. James sat at her table, eating quietly and reading one of her books by lamplight, a volume of poetry she'd thought no hired hand would even notice, let alone open. When he looked up and caught her watching, neither of them looked away immediately. In that moment, Ruth felt something shift in the air between them, something that had nothing to do with employer and employee, creditor and debtor, or any of the other tidy categories that were supposed to define their arrangement. It was the beginning of something neither of them had planned for, and Ruth Calder, who prided herself on being prepared for anything the mountains might throw at her, suddenly realized she was walking into territory she'd never mapped before. 3 days into their arrangement, Ruth discovered that James Morrison was full of surprises. She'd expected him to be handy enough with basic labor, hauling water, splitting wood, the kind of work any ranch hand could manage. What she hadn't expected was to find him at dawn on the 4th morning, crouched beside her chicken coop with a handful of small tools she didn't recognize, methodically repairing the wire mesh that had been damaged by some persistent predator. "Where did you get those?" she asked, nodding toward the tools. James looked up, his hands stilling on the wire. "I made them. Found some scrap metal in your shed and worked them over the fire last night. Hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep, and I noticed the chickens were getting nervous about something getting at them." Ruth studied his handiwork. The repair was neat, professional, and would hold against anything short of a determined bear. "You know metalwork?" "Some." James returned to his work, his fingers steady despite the early morning cold. "Used to have a forge of my own." The simple statement opened up questions Ruth wasn't sure she had the right to ask. A man who owned a forge wasn't the sort who usually ended up owing money to half the saloons in a cattle town. But before she could decide how to probe deeper, James surprised her again. "Miss Calder, can you read?" The question was so unexpected that Ruth almost laughed. "Of course I can read. What kind of question is that?" James gestured toward the bundle of letters he'd pulled from his shirt pocket, the same letters Ruth had noticed him carrying since the auction but had never mentioned. "Could you help me with something? They're letters I've been meaning to send, but I want to make sure they say what I mean them to say." Ruth felt her chest tighten. Letters meant family, connections, people who cared whether James Morrison lived or died. She'd assumed, perhaps unfairly, that a man alone enough to be sold at auction had no one waiting for word from him. "Who are you writing to?" James's hand stilled on the chicken wire. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain so raw that Ruth had to force herself not to look away. "My wife," he said quietly. "Sarah, she died 2 years ago, but I still write to her sometimes. Tell her about things that happened, places I've been. Foolish, I suppose." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. Not because James had been married, most men his age had history, but because of the way he said it. The present tense. The careful way he held those letters, like they contained something precious and fragile. "James," she said gently, "if your wife is gone, I know she can't read them." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "But writing them helps me think things through. And lately I've been thinking maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to let her rest." Ruth felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of grief so familiar it took her breath away. She understood now why he'd looked past the crowd at the auction, why he carried himself like a man walking through a world that had stopped making sense. "The letters aren't really for her," she said softly. "They're for you." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I'll help you with them," Ruth offered, "if you want." That afternoon, as storm clouds began building over the western peaks, Ruth found herself sitting across from James at her kitchen table, reading words that made her heart ache. "My dearest Sarah," one letter began, "I find myself in the mountains now, working for a woman who reminds me a little of you, not in looks, but in the way she carries herself. Independent, strong. She doesn't need anyone. But she's kind enough to let me work off my debts in a place where I can think clearly for the first time in months." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she read. "James, you don't owe money because of drinking or gambling, do you?" He shook his head. "My business partner, Tom Bradley. We had a cattle operation down in Colorado, built it from nothing over 10 years. When Sarah got sick, I mortgaged everything to pay for doctors, treatments, anything that might help. Tom was supposed to manage things while I took care of her." "What happened?" James's jaw tightened. "Tom had been skimming money for years, covering it up with false books. When Sarah died and I tried to get back to work, I found out he'd used my grief to clean out everything we'd built. Sold the cattle, sold the land, and left me holding paper on debts I never made." Ruth felt anger flare in her chest, hot and protective. "Couldn't you prove it? Take it to a judge? With what? Tom had covered his tracks well, and I was too broken to fight him properly. By the time I pulled myself together enough to think clearly, he'd disappeared, and the creditors were coming after me." James stared at the letter in Ruth's hands. "I've been drifting ever since, picking up work where I could, but the story followed me. Hard to get decent employment when word gets around that you can't be trusted with money." Ruth set the letter down carefully. "But you can be trusted, can I?" James met her eyes. "I trusted Tom with everything I'd worked for. Trusted him to take care of business while I watched my wife die by inches. Maybe the folks who won't hire me have the right of it." The first drops of rain began pattering against the cabin windows, and Ruth could see the storm building in earnest. The kind of early snow squall that could trap them for days if it developed fully. "That's fool talk," she said sharply. "A man grieving his wife isn't responsible for another man's thievery." James was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain intensify. "Storm's coming in fast," Ruth nodded, recognizing the deflection but allowing it. "Could be a big one. Sometimes they blow through quick, but if this settles in for a few days, we'll be snowed in until it passes. Maybe I should head back to town before it gets worse." The suggestion sent an unexpected spike of panic through Ruth's chest. "Why?" "Because I'm eating your food and using your supplies, and winter's coming, whether I'm here or not. You planned provisions for one person, not two." Ruth stood abruptly and walked to the window, watching the snow that had started mixing with the rain. The flakes were large and heavy, the kind that meant business. "You're not going anywhere in this. Even if you made it down the pass alive, which you probably wouldn't, what then? Back to some saloon, drinking yourself to sleep and writing letters to a dead woman?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, and she saw James flinch, as if she'd struck him. "Ruth, I didn't mean—" "No, you listen to me." She turned from the window, her grey eyes blazing. I didn't spend $50 on you just to watch you walk away the first time things get complicated. We have enough supplies for 2 people to make it through winter, and if we're careful, we'll have enough left over for spring. But that means both of us working together, not one of us running off every time the going gets rough. James stood slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Why does it matter to you? You could have hired any of a dozen men to help you prepare for winter. Ruth felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see right through to the loneliness she'd spent years learning to ignore. Because, she said finally, maybe I'm tired of doing everything alone. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. Outside, the storm was building in earnest now. The wind picking up and driving snow against the windows with increasing force. Looks like we're stuck with each other, James said quietly. Ruth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd thought bringing James to the mountain would be simple, a business arrangement, a practical solution to a practical problem. Instead, she'd invited a man carrying his own broken heart into her carefully guarded world. And now she was beginning to understand that some storms changed everything they touched. The storm trapped them for 3 days, and by the time it passed, something fundamental had shifted in the rhythm of Ruth's solitary life. She woke on the 4th morning to the sound of hammering, steady and purposeful, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. Through her window, she could see James working on the roof of the lean-to, replacing shingles that had been torn loose by the storm's fierce winds. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd done such work before, his hands sure on the tools, despite the cold. Ruth dressed quickly and stepped outside, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The world had been transformed by the storm. Everything covered in a blanket of pristine snow that would have been beautiful if it weren't so early in the season. How bad is the damage? She called up to James. He paused in his hammering and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Could have been worse. A few shingles here, some loose boards on the chicken coop, and that section of fence by the spring will need rebuilding. But the cabin came through fine. You built her solid. Ruth felt a flush of pride at the compliment. My father always said if you're going to do something, do it right the first time. James climbed down from the roof, moving carefully on the snow-slick ladder. Smart man! This place could weather just about anything short of an avalanche. Don't tempt fate, Ruth said with a slight smile. We've got enough challenges without borrowing trouble. As they worked together that day, James repairing storm damage while Ruth checked their supplies and planned for the shortened growing season, Ruth found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companion. There was something soothing about having another person moving through her space, sharing the burden of the endless tasks that mountain life demanded. But more than that, she was beginning to see glimpses of the man James had been before grief and betrayal had worn him down. When he concentrated on his work, the lines around his eyes softened. When he caught her watching him and offered a small smile, she could imagine him younger, happier, building a life with the woman whose memory still filled his letters. That evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing a simple supper of rabbit stew and biscuits, Ruth made a decision that surprised them both. I want to show you something, she said. Rising from her chair and climbing the ladder to her sleeping loft, she returned with a small wooden box, worn smooth by handling, and set it on the table between them. For a moment she hesitated, her fingers tracing the simple carving on the lid, a mountain rose, the symbol her father had used to mark things that were precious to him. I've never shown this to anyone, she said quietly, then lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a ring. Not a wedding ring, but something older, more delicate. A thin band of gold set with a small diamond that caught the firelight and threw it back in tiny sparkles. It was my mother's engagement ring, Ruth explained, not touching the ring, but looking at it with an expression James couldn't quite read. She died when I was 12, and my father kept it hidden away like it was too precious for daylight. Said he was saving it for when I found someone worthy of wearing it. James studied Ruth's face in the lamplight. Did you ever want to wear it? Ruth's laugh held no humor. I thought I did. Once, there was a man in town a few years back. Samuel Hartwell. He owned the general store, seemed steady and kind. We courted for almost 6 months, and I started thinking maybe it was time to let someone into my life. What happened? Ruth closed the box with a soft click. I found out he was courting 2 other women at the same time, telling each of us what we wanted to hear. When I confronted him about it, he said I shouldn't expect exclusivity from a man when I wasn't offering him anything a wife should. James's jaw tightened. What did you mean by that? He meant I wouldn't share his bed before we were properly married. Said a woman my age, living alone like I did, probably wasn't the marrying kind anyway. Ruth stood and carried the box back toward the ladder. So I told him he was right. I wasn't the marrying kind. At least not to him. She climbed halfway up the ladder before James's voice stopped her. Ruth! She turned to look down at him. That man was a fool. The simple statement, delivered with quiet conviction, made Ruth's chest tighten unexpectedly. She'd told herself for years that Samuel's rejection hadn't mattered, that she was better off alone. But hearing James dismiss the cruel words so easily made her realize how deeply they'd actually cut. Maybe, she said softly, or maybe he was just being honest about what he saw. Then he was blind as well as foolish. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks and quickly climbed the rest of the way to her loft, tucking the box back into its hiding place among her quilts. When she came back down, James was tending the fire, giving her time to compose herself. "We should turn in early," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Tomorrow we need to start thinking seriously about winter preparations. The storm took 3 days out of our schedule, and there's still a lot to do." James nodded and rose from his chair by the fire. "Ruth," she looked at him, noting the way the flames cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw. "Thank you for trusting me with that story. I know it wasn't easy to share." After he'd gone out to the lean-to, Ruth sat alone by the dying fire, staring into the coals and wondering what she was doing. For 5 years, she'd protected herself by keeping everyone at arm's length, by never allowing anyone close enough to hurt her again. Now she'd brought a stranger into her home, shared her most private disappointment, and found herself looking forward to his company in ways that made her nervous. The problem was, James wasn't feeling like a stranger anymore. When he smiled at something, she said, when he worked alongside her with quiet competence, when he looked at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should, in those moments, he felt like exactly what she'd spent years convincing herself she didn't need, someone who belonged in the empty spaces of her carefully constructed life. Ruth banked the fire and climbed to her loft, but sleep was slow to come. Through her small window, she could see a thin line of light coming from the lean-to where James was probably writing another letter to his dead wife, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to be loved so completely that death couldn't break the connection. She'd never had that kind of love, had never even believed it was possible until she saw the careful way James handled those letters, the tenderness in his voice when he spoke of Sarah. Now, lying in her narrow bed with snow beginning to fall again outside her window, Ruth Calder found herself wanting something. She'd spent years learning not to want someone who would write letters about her long after she was gone. The morning brought clear skies and the kind of crisp mountain air that made every breath feel like a gift. Ruth woke to find James already up, tending a small fire outside and warming coffee in her battered tin pot. The domestic scene struck her as both foreign and oddly comfortable. How long had it been since someone had thought to make coffee for her? "Morning," James said, offering her a steaming cup. "I took the liberty of checking on the animals. Patience has a stone bruise on her left fore, nothing serious, but she'll need a few days' rest." Ruth accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm metal. "Thank you. We'll need to take inventory today, see exactly what we're working with for supplies." "Already started," James said, producing a piece of paper covered with his neat handwriting. "Made a list of what's in the root cellar and the storage room. If you're agreeable, I thought we might hunt today. Saw elk sign near the ridge yesterday, and fresh meat would help stretch the other provisions. Ruth studied the list, impressed by his thoroughness. You did all this before sunrise? Couldn't sleep. James's expression grew distant for a moment. Sometimes it's easier to keep busy than to think too much. Ruth understood that feeling too well. Show me this elk sign. If there's a herd moving through, we'll want to take advantage while we can. An hour later, they were climbing through the forest above Ruth's cabin, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Ruth carried her father's Winchester, the rifle that had taught her independence and put food on her table for more years than she cared to count. James moved beside her with the quiet competence of a man who knew how to read the wilderness, pointing out tracks and signs that told the story of what had passed this way. There, he said quietly, crouching beside a cluster of aspen trees. Big bull, probably 6 points, moving with a small herd. See how the doe's tracks overlap here? Ruth knelt beside him, studying the impressions in the soft earth. You know tracking. My grandfather taught me when I was young. Creek Indian on my mother's side. James glanced at her. That bother you? Ruth met his eyes steadily. Should it? Some folks think it should. Some folks think a lot of fool things. Ruth stood, shouldering her rifle. How long ago did they pass through? James touched the edge of a hoofprint, feeling the moisture in the soil. Hour, maybe 2. They'll be feeding in the meadow just over that ridge if the wind stays steady. They climbed in comfortable silence. And Ruth found herself watching the way James moved through the forest, careful, respectful, taking nothing for granted. When they reached the ridgeline, he held up a hand to stop her, then eased forward to peer over the crest. 5 does and the bull, he whispered. Good size. Clean shot from here if you can manage it. Ruth settled into position, checking her rifle and finding her target through the scope. The bull elk stood magnificent in the morning light, his massive antlers catching the sun as he grazed peacefully with his herd. But as she lined up the shot, Ruth's hands began to tremble slightly, not from cold or nervousness, but from an unexpected awareness of James lying beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. When he reached over to steady her rifle, his hand briefly covered hers, and she felt a jolt of sensation that had nothing to do with hunting. Easy, James murmured, his voice low and soothing. Take your time. Ruth forced herself to focus on the target, drawing in a slow breath and letting half of it out before squeezing the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the bull elk dropped cleanly, the shot echoing across the valley below. Perfect, James said, admiration clear in his voice. Right through the heart. Ruth lowered the rifle, trying to ignore the way her pulse was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the successful hunt. We'll need to field dress him quickly and get the meat back to the cabin. Can't afford to waste anything. They worked together for the next several hours, James proving as skilled with a skinning knife as he was with everything else. Ruth found herself stealing glances at his hands as he worked, strong, capable hands that moved with practiced precision. When he caught her watching, she felt heat rise in her cheeks and quickly looked away. You're thinking about her, Ruth said suddenly, not sure why she needed to voice the thought. James paused in his work. Sarah, what makes you say that? You get a certain look when you're remembering, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't. James was quiet for a long moment, then resumed his careful work. Sarah never liked hunting, said she understood the need for it, but she couldn't bear to watch an animal die. He smiled slightly. She'd make me promise to be quick and clean about it, to honor what we took. Ruth felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, which surprised and disturbed her. She sounds like she was a good woman. She was. James looked up from his work, meeting Ruth's eyes directly. But she's gone, and I'm here with you. That has to mean something. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that Ruth wasn't sure she was ready to explore. Before she could respond, James returned his attention to the elk, leaving her to wonder what, exactly, he meant by that statement. The trip back to the cabin was accomplished in stages, both of them carrying as much meat as they could manage. By the time they had everything safely stored, the sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. That evening, as they sat down to a supper of fresh elk steaks, Ruth found herself studying James across the table. The firelight played across his features, and she noticed things she'd overlooked before, the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his mouth curved when he was amused, the quiet strength in his hands as he cut his meat. "Ruth," James said suddenly, catching her staring. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "That man in town, Samuel, did you love him?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "I thought I did. Or maybe I wanted to love him, wanted it badly enough that I convinced myself I felt more than I actually did. And now—" Ruth set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "Now I think I didn't know what love was supposed to feel like." James reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, a gesture so gentle it made her chest ache. "Maybe that's not your fault. Maybe you just hadn't met the right person yet." The touch lasted only a moment before James pulled his hand back, but Ruth felt the warmth of it long after he'd moved away. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between hope and resignation. "Desire and duty, James," she began, then stopped, not knowing how to finish the sentence. "I know," he said quietly. "I know this is complicated. I know I have no right to feel anything for anyone when my wife—" He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "But I can't help what's happening here. Ruth, I can't help the way I look forward to seeing you each morning, or the way it feels when you smile at me, or how right it seems to be working beside you." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. "Your letters—" "I haven't written one since the storm," James admitted. "For the first time in 2 years, I wake up thinking about today instead of yesterday. That scares me." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Ruth stood abruptly, needing space to think, to breathe, to make sense of the emotions churning inside her chest. "I should bank the fire," she said, moving toward the hearth. But James was there before her, his hand covering hers on the poker. "This time he didn't pull away, Ruth," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Look at me." She turned and found herself caught in his dark gaze. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stood frozen, the weight of possibility hanging heavy between them. Then James lifted his free hand to her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "I don't know what this is," he whispered. "I don't know if I have the right to want it. But God help me, I do want it." Ruth felt herself leaning into his touch, her carefully constructed walls crumbling under the tenderness in his eyes. "James!" The sound of wind picking up outside broke the spell, reminding them both of where they were, what was at stake. James stepped back, his hand falling to his side, leaving Ruth feeling cold and strangely bereft. "I should—" he began. "Yes," Ruth said quickly. "You should." "We both should." But neither of them moved for several long heartbeats, caught in the gravity of what had almost happened between them. 2 weeks later, Ruth was checking her trap lines in the early morning mist when she heard voices coming from the direction of her cabin, voices that didn't belong to James. She moved quickly through the forest, her father's rifle ready in her hands, using the trees for cover as she approached her home. Through the clearing, she could see 3 men on horseback near her front door. James stood on the porch, his hands visible but ready, speaking with them in low tones she couldn't quite make out. Ruth circled around to get a better view and felt her blood run cold when she recognized the leader, Buck Morrison, a man whose reputation for violence had preceded him into every mining camp and cattle town, from Colorado to Montana. The other 2 were younger, meaner-looking, with the kind of eyes that enjoyed causing pain. She crept closer, using the woodshed for cover, until she could hear their conversation. "Now that's real interesting, Morrison," Buck was saying, his voice carrying the lazy menace of a man who enjoyed having power over others. "You're telling me you're working for some woman way up here in the mountains, all legal and proper-like?" "That's right," James replied, his voice steady despite the tension Ruth could see in his shoulders. "Working off a debt, all square and documented. See? That's where you're wrong. Buck pulled a piece of paper from his coat. Because, according to this here warrant, you skipped out on some obligations down in Millerville. Seems there's folks who want to have a word with you about some missing money. Ruth's hands tightened on her rifle. She could see the lie for what it was. Buck Morrison had no authority to serve warrants, and James had paid his debts fair and square at the auction. But she could also see that the three men weren't interested in legalities. I don't owe anyone in Millerville anything, James said carefully. My debts were settled publicly with witnesses. Well now, that's a matter of opinion, isn't it? Buck's horse danced sideways as he leaned forward in his saddle. See, there's some folks who think you might know where Tom Bradley disappeared to. Seems he left town real sudden-like after cleaning out some accounts that didn't belong to him. Ruth saw James stiffen at the mention of his former partner's name. I haven't seen Tom Bradley in over a year. Don't know where he went and don't much care. That's a real shame, Buck said, signaling to his companions. Because we was hoping you might be willing to help us track him down. Men like you, good with reading sign and such, might be real useful in finding someone who don't want to be found. I'm not interested in tracking anyone, James replied. I've got work to do here. Buck's expression hardened. Well, maybe we can change your mind about that. The younger man on Buck's right started to reach for his gun, and Ruth knew she was out of time. She stepped out from behind the woodshed, her rifle raised and trained on Buck's chest. I wouldn't, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. All three men turned to look at her, and Ruth saw surprise flicker across Buck's face before it was replaced by calculated interest. Well now, he said slowly, you must be the woman who thinks she owns this here fellow. I don't own anyone, Ruth replied, not lowering her rifle. But James Morrison is under my protection, and you're trespassing on my land. I suggest you move along, Buck laughed, a sound without humor. Lady, you got no idea who you're pointing that rifle at. Buck Morrison, Ruth said calmly. Wanted for cattle rustling in Colorado, suspected in at least 3 killings, and dumb enough to threaten a woman on her own property. She shifted her aim slightly. I know exactly who you are. The surprise on Buck's face was genuine this time. You got a smart mouth for someone who's outnumbered 3-1. Take a closer look around, Ruth suggested. Count the gun barrels. James had moved during the distraction, positioning himself behind partial cover with his own weapon drawn. The 2 younger men were looking nervous now, realizing they were caught in a crossfire with nowhere to run. This is real simple, Ruth continued. You can ride out of here and pretend this conversation never happened, or you can try your luck against 2 people who know this terrain better than you do and have nothing to lose. Buck studied her for a long moment, taking in her steady hands, the calm certainty in her voice, the way she held her rifle like someone who knew how to use it. This ain't over, he said finally. Yes, it is, Ruth replied, because if I see any of you on my land again, I won't bother with warnings. The 3 men turned their horses and rode off, but not before Buck called back over his shoulder, You're protecting a man who ain't worth protecting, lady. James Morrison's got blood on his hands, and sooner or later, it's going to catch up with him. Ruth kept her rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the tree line, then slowly lowered the weapon. James approached her, his face grim. Ruth, I'm sorry. I never thought... Don't, she cut him off. Don't you dare apologize for something that wasn't your fault. You don't understand. Buck was right about one thing. I do have blood on my hands. Ruth turned to face him fully. Tell me. James was quiet for a long moment, staring off toward the mountains. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. After Sarah died, when I found out what Tom had done, I went looking for him. Found him in a saloon in Denver, drunk and spending money that should have gone to pay for her medicine. James's hands clenched at his sides. I wasn't thinking straight. Hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating. All I could see was his face laughing while my wife... What happened? I called him out, right there in front of everyone. He went for his gun first, but I was faster. James looked at Ruth, his eyes hollow. I killed him, Ruth. Shot him down in front of a dozen witnesses. Ruth felt the air leave her lungs. James, the law called it self-defense, since he drew first. But Buck Morrison was Tom's cousin, and he's been looking for me ever since. Not for justice, for revenge. Ruth set her rifle aside and moved closer to James, close enough to see the pain etched in every line of his face. How long has he been hunting you? 8 months. It's why I ended up in Millerville, why I couldn't keep steady work. Buck's got connections, puts word out that I'm trouble wherever I go. Ruth reached out and took his hands in hers, feeling the tremor that ran through him at the contact. James, look at me. When he met her eyes, she saw the shame and fear he'd been carrying. You defended yourself against a man who stole your life and caused your wife's death. That doesn't make you a killer. It makes you human. Buck won't see it that way. And he won't stop coming. Then we'll be ready for him, Ruth said simply. James stared at her. Ruth, you don't understand what you're getting into. Buck Morrison isn't just dangerous, he's relentless. And he's got friends. Ruth smiled, and there was steel in the expression. So do I. This is my mountain, James. I know every trail, every hiding place, every advantage the terrain can give us. If Buck Morrison wants to make this a war, he picked the wrong woman to fight. James pulled her closer, and this time Ruth didn't resist. When his arms came around her, when she felt the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek, she realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, this man had become more than just someone she was helping. He'd become someone she couldn't bear to lose. That night, as snow began falling again outside the cabin windows, Ruth sat by the fire sketching while James cleaned his rifle at the kitchen table. The domestic scene felt both natural and precious, as if they were stealing moments of peace before a storm neither could avoid. "You're drawing me," James observed without looking up from his work. Ruth's pencil stilled on the paper. She hadn't realized he'd noticed. "How did you know?" "You get a certain look when you're concentrating, and you've been stealing glances at me for the past hour." He finished with his rifle and set it aside, then moved to sit beside her on the hearth. "May I see?" Ruth hesitated, then turned the sketchbook toward him. On the page was his profile, captured in careful detail as he worked, the concentration in his expression, the way the firelight played across the strong lines of his face, the unconscious grace in his hands as they handled the weapon. "It's beautiful," James said softly. "You're very talented. It's just something I do to pass time." Ruth started to close the book, but James gently stopped her. "Show me the others. James, please." Ruth flipped back through the pages, revealing drawings that chronicled her solitary life. The view from her cabin at sunrise, Patience grazing in the meadow, the delicate wildflowers that bloomed briefly each spring. But as James looked through them, Ruth realized how empty they seemed now. "Beautiful but empty. These are all places," James said eventually. "No people. I live alone. There haven't been people to draw." James turned another page and found something that made him pause, a sketch of 2 figures working together to repair a fence, drawn from memory after one of their shared tasks. In the drawing, the figures seemed to fit together naturally, their movements complementary, their focus shared. "Except now there are," he said quietly. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I shouldn't have presumed, Ruth." James closed the sketchbook and set it aside, then turned to face her fully. "In these past weeks, working beside you, sharing meals with you, talking by this fire, I felt more alive than I have since Sarah died. More like the man I used to be. James, your wife, Sarah is gone." The words seemed to cost him something, but his voice was steady. "She's been gone for 2 years, and I've been so busy mourning her that I forgot how to live. Until I came here. Until I met you." Ruth's breath caught. "What are you saying?" James reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "I'm saying that Sarah would want me to be happy. She'd want me to find love again if I could." And Ruth, his voice dropped to a whisper. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hit Ruth like a physical force. She dreamed of hearing something like this, but now that the moment was here, she felt paralyzed by the weight of it. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be what someone needs." "You already are," James said, "just by being yourself. Strong, independent, kind, beautiful." "I'm not beautiful." Samuel made that clear. "Samuel was a fool," James said fiercely. "You are beautiful, Ruth. When you concentrate on your drawings, when you smile at something I've said, when you stand up to 3 armed men to protect someone you care about, you take my breath away." Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm scared, so am I." James leaned his forehead against hers. "I'm scared that Buck Morrison will find us before we have a chance to see where this leads. I'm scared that I don't deserve to be happy again. But mostly I'm scared of wasting whatever time we have, because I'm too much of a coward to tell you how I feel." Ruth closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of his touch, the solid reality of his presence. When she opened them again, James was watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her chest ache. "James," she said softly, "kiss me." He didn't need to be asked twice. His lips found hers with a gentleness that spoke of reverence, of someone who understood the precious nature of what was happening between them. Ruth had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such careful attention, such infinite patience. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. James rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face. "We should probably talk about what this means," he said quietly. "Later," Ruth murmured, pulling him closer. "Right now I just want to feel this. Feel you." They made love that night by the dying fire, tender and slow, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with the careful attention they'd both given to the mountain trails. Ruth had expected awkwardness, uncertainty. Instead, she found a sense of rightness that surprised her with its intensity. Afterward, as they lay wrapped together in her quilts, James traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Ruth, I need to tell you something. About the letters I used to write to Sarah." Ruth tensed slightly. "James, you don't have to." "I do." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I stopped writing them because I realized I was holding on to grief instead of holding on to love. The love I had for Sarah will always be part of me, but it doesn't have to define me anymore." Ruth turned in his arms so she could see his face. "What changed?" "You did." James smiled, and Ruth saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Peace. "Sarah and we were young when we met. We grew up together, learned about love together. What I feel for you is different, deeper maybe, because I understand now how precious it is. How easily it can be lost." Ruth felt her throat tighten. "I love you too. I think I started falling the moment I saw you standing on that platform, refusing to let them break your spirit." James kissed her forehead. "We'll figure out the rest as we go. Buck Morrison, the future, all of it. But whatever comes, we'll face it together." Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the cabin windows. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Ruth and James had found something worth fighting for, a love that had grown not in spite of their brokenness, but because of how they'd chosen to heal each other. For the first time in her adult life, Ruth Calder felt truly complete. And for the first time since his wife's death, James Morrison believed in tomorrow. Spring came early that year, melting the snow faster than usual and turning the mountain passes into rushing torrents of snowmelt. Ruth and James had settled into a rhythm of shared life that felt as natural as breathing, working together during the day, talking by the fire in the evenings, falling asleep in each other's arms when the mountain night grew cold. They were checking the fence lines on a morning bright with promise when they heard the sound of a single horse approaching. Both froze, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. But the rider who emerged from the tree line wore a U.S. Marshal's badge and rode with the unhurried confidence of a man carrying legal authority. "Miss Calder?" "James Morrison?" The marshal was middle-aged, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. "I'm Marshal William Hayes. I'd like to speak with you both, if you don't mind." Ruth and James exchanged glances. "What about?" Ruth asked, her rifle still visible in her hands, but not quite threatening. "About Tom Bradley," Marshal Hayes replied, dismounting and approaching them with his hands clearly visible. "And about clearing up some misunderstandings regarding Mr. Morrison here." James stepped forward, his body tense. "If this is about what happened in Denver, it's about a lot of things," the marshal interrupted gently. "But mostly it's about the fact that you've been carrying a burden that isn't yours to carry." He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with official wax. "Mr. Morrison, 3 weeks ago, we arrested a man named Curtis Webb in Santa Fe. Ring any bells?" James shook his head, confused. Webb was Tom Bradley's real partner, the one who actually planned and executed the theft of your cattle operation. Bradley was just the front man, the face you knew. Webb was the one with the connections to move stolen cattle, forge documents, and disappear money through banks in 3 different territories. Ruth felt the ground shift under her feet. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Tom Bradley was as much a victim as Mr. Morrison here. Bradley got in over his head with gambling debts to some very dangerous people. Webb used those debts to force Bradley into the scheme, threatening his family if he didn't cooperate." James's face had gone white. "That's impossible. Tom was my partner for years. He was being blackmailed and terrorized into betraying you," Marshal Hayes said gently. "When you confronted him in that saloon in Denver, he was already a broken man. Webb had taken everything from him too, and Bradley knew his family was next if he didn't deliver more money." The marshal handed the envelope to James. "These are Webb's full confession and the recovered financial records. Bradley kept meticulous documentation of everything Webb forced him to do, hidden away as insurance. When we arrested Webb, we found it all." James's hands shook as he opened the envelope and began reading. Ruth moved closer, reading over his shoulder, and felt her heart break as the truth unfolded across the pages. Tom Bradley hadn't stolen from James out of greed or callousness. He'd been caught in Webb's web, forced to choose between betraying his oldest friend and watching his wife and children be murdered. The documents showed how Webb had systematically stripped both men's operations, using Bradley's access and trust to legitimize the theft while keeping the real profits for himself. "There's more," Marshal Hayes continued. "Tom Bradley didn't die in that saloon in Denver." James looked up sharply. "What?" "He was wounded badly, but he survived. He's been recovering in a church mission outside Denver, and when he heard we'd arrested Webb, he sent a letter asking us to find you." The marshal pulled out another envelope. "He wants to make amends, Mr. Morrison. He wants to return what Webb forced him to steal." James stared at the second envelope as if it might bite him. "Tom's alive?" "Very much so. And according to this confession and the financial records, you're a wealthy man. Mr. Morrison, your cattle operation was worth considerably more than even you knew. And Webb's been sitting on the profits for 2 years. With interest and penalties, the recovery amounts to just over $40,000. Ruth felt the world tilt around her. $40,000 was a fortune, enough to buy a ranch, a future, anything a man might want. Enough to make James Morrison a prominent citizen in any town he chose to settle in. "There's one more thing," Marshal Hayes added, his expression growing serious. "Buck Morrison has been arrested for cattle rustling and murder in Colorado Territory. He won't be bothering anyone for a very long time." James sank down onto a nearby stump, the papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. Ruth stood frozen, watching the man she loved grapple with the complete reversal of everything he'd believed about his life for the past 2 years. "I don't understand," James said finally. "If Tom was forced into it, why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he explain?" "Because Webb threatened to kill his family if he said anything. And because—" Marshal Hayes paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because he was ashamed. Tom Bradley loved you like a brother, Mr. Morrison. Having to betray you nearly destroyed him. He said in his letter that he hoped dying would be easier than living with what he'd done." Ruth felt tears sting her eyes as she watched James process this information. Everything he'd built his grief and guilt around, Tom's betrayal, his own violent response, the blood he thought was on his hands, had been built on lies and manipulation. "What happens now?" Ruth asked quietly. "Now Mr. Morrison gets his life back," Marshal Hayes replied. "His reputation, his money, his future. The territorial governor has already signed papers clearing his name completely. As for the money, it's waiting in a bank in Denver whenever he's ready to claim it." James looked up at Ruth, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. Confusion, hope, and underneath it all, the terrible weight of choice. Ruth, he said softly. Aye, you need time to think, she said quickly, stepping back from him. This changes everything. Does it? James stood, reaching toward her, but Ruth had already taken another step back. $40,000, James. You could go anywhere, do anything. Buy a ranch in California, start over somewhere no one knows your story. She forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. You could have the life you were meant to have before all this happened. What if the life I'm meant to have is here with you? The question hung in the air between them, and Ruth realized that despite everything they'd shared, despite the love they'd declared, she didn't believe he would choose her over the chance to reclaim his real life. Miss Calder, Marshall Hayes interjected gently, there's something else you should know. About the auction where you bought Mr. Morrison's contract. Ruth turned to him, confused. It was illegal. Mr. Morrison's debts had already been settled by the recovery of Webb's assets. He should never have been sold in the first place. Which means our contract is void, Ruth finished, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. James was a free man. Free to leave, free to reclaim his fortune, free to forget the mountain woman who'd bought him in a moment of impulse and somehow fallen in love with him along the way. Ruth, please, James said, moving toward her again. Let me explain what this means. I know what it means, Ruth said, backing toward her horse. It means you have choices now, real choices, and you need time to figure out what you want to do with them. She mounted patience and looked down at James, memorizing his face in case it was the last time she'd see it. When you decide what you want your new life to look like, you know where to find me. Then she rode away, leaving James standing in the meadow with $40,000 in recovered assets and a future as vast and uncertain as the mountain sky above them. Ruth rode hard for 3 hours before the weight of what she'd done finally forced her to stop. She dismounted beside a mountain stream, her hands shaking as she loosened Patience's cinch and let the mare drink. The sound of rushing water should have been soothing, but all Ruth could hear was the echo of Marshall Hayes's words. $40,000. Illegal auction. Free to go anywhere. Free. James was free to reclaim his life, his fortune, his place in respectable society. And she'd run like a coward, rather than face the inevitable moment when he'd realized that freedom meant he didn't have to settle for a mountain woman who'd never fit into the world he deserved. Ruth pulled her worn leather journal from her saddlebags, the same journal she'd shown James that first night, filled with pressed flowers and sketches of her solitary life. Now, as she flipped through pages that chronicled months of shared meals, stolen glances and growing love, each drawing seemed to mock her with its naive hope. She'd started packing the night before, after lying awake, listening to James pace the cabin floor until dawn. She'd heard him talking to himself, weighing options, making lists of possibilities in that methodical way he approached every decision. When she'd finally crept down from the loft at sunrise, she'd found him sitting at their table with papers spread everywhere, bank documents, property deeds, letters from attorneys in Denver. He'd looked up when she entered, his face drawn with exhaustion and something else she couldn't read. Ruth, we need to talk about what this means. I know what it means, she'd said quickly, busying herself with making coffee to avoid meeting his eyes. You have choices now, real choices. That's what I want to discuss. I've been thinking about how we could... I'm going to check the trap lines, Ruth had interrupted, grabbing her rifle and heading for the door. We'll talk when I get back. But she hadn't gone to check trap lines. She'd gone to her hidden camp to pack the few belongings she couldn't bear to leave behind, then waited until she was sure James would be meeting with the marshal before returning to collect the rest. Now, sitting beside the stream, with afternoon shadows lengthening across the valley, Ruth forced herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She hadn't packed because she thought James would abandon her. She'd packed because she was terrified he wouldn't. The thought of him staying out of duty, of building a life with her because he felt obligated to honor what they'd shared when he had no other options. That was worse than being abandoned. Ruth had seen enough loveless marriages, enough relationships built on convenience rather than choice, To know she'd rather spend her life alone than spend it wondering if she was someone's second-best option. A sound behind her made Ruth spin around, her hand instinctively moving toward her rifle. But it wasn't danger approaching through the trees. It was James, leading his horse and looking like a man who'd been riding hard for hours. "Don't," he said when he saw her tense. "Don't run again, Ruth, please." Ruth straightened, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'm not running. I'm giving you space to think clearly about what you want to do with your new circumstances." James ground-tied his horse and approached her slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "What I want is to understand why the woman I love disappeared the moment I got my life back." "Because your life back doesn't include me," Ruth said, the words coming out more bitter than she'd intended. $40,000, James. You could buy a mansion in San Francisco, marry a banker's daughter, become someone important again. Why would you want to stay here with the woman who saved me?" James interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "With the woman who gave me a reason to believe in tomorrow? With the woman I've fallen completely, irrevocably in love with?" Ruth felt tears threaten and turned away, staring out across the valley. "You love who you think I am. The woman who was there when you needed shelter, when you needed healing. But James, I'm not the kind of woman men choose when they have real choices." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. James was quiet for so long that Ruth began to think he'd finally understood, finally seen the truth she'd been trying to protect him from. Then she felt his hands on her shoulders, gentle but insistent, turning her to face him. "Ruth Calder," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Look at me," reluctantly. She met his eyes and saw something there that made her chest tighten. Not pity or obligation, but a fierce, unwavering determination. "I have spent the last 18 hours trying to figure out how to convince you that my feelings for you have nothing to do with convenience or gratitude or lack of other options. Do you want to know what I've decided?" Ruth nodded, not trusting her voice. James reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth with handling. "I've decided that words aren't enough, that I can't tell you how I feel. I have to show you." He dropped to one knee beside the mountain stream, holding the box out toward her with hands that trembled slightly. "This was my grandmother's ring. She gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for the woman who made my heart complete. I carried it through the war, through building my first ranch, through my marriage to Sarah, but I never gave it to anyone. Ruth, not even Sarah, because some part of me always knew I was waiting for something, someone I hadn't met yet." Ruth stared at the box, her heart hammering against her ribs. "James, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a small sapphire that caught the afternoon light. "I'm not asking you to marry me because I'm grateful, or because I feel obligated, or because I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm asking because I love you, because I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you're not someone I settled for. You're someone I chose, the only someone I want to choose." Ruth felt the last of her defenses crumble. "But the money means I can give you everything you deserve. It means I can court you properly, build you that art studio I promised, buy enough land to ensure you never have to worry about anyone disturbing your peace." James's eyes never left her face. "It means I can offer you a future instead of just asking you to take a chance on a broken man with nothing to give." "You were never broken," Ruth whispered. "And you always had everything to give." James smiled, and Ruth saw the peace in his expression that she'd captured in her drawings. "Then say yes. Say you'll marry me. Say you'll let me spend the next 40 years showing you that you're not my second choice or my consolation prize. You're my first choice. My only choice. My heart." Ruth looked down at the ring, then back at James's face. In his eyes, she saw her future reflected back, not the lonely, careful existence she'd built for herself, but a life filled with shared laughter, quiet mornings, the contentment of being truly known and completely loved. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as barely more than a breath. "Yes? Yes, James Morrison. I'll marry you." Ruth knelt beside him in the soft grass by the stream. But only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if you ever regret choosing this life, this place, me, you'll tell me. Don't stay out of duty or honor or some misguided idea of what you owe me. Stay because you want to be here. James slipped the ring onto her finger, then brought her hand to his lips. Ruth, I promise you that every morning for the rest of my life, I'll wake up grateful that a stubborn, brave, beautiful mountain woman took a chance on me at an auction. And if there ever comes a day when I'm not grateful for that, which there won't, but if there is, you'll be the first to know. Ruth launched herself into his arms, and James caught her, spinning her around as if she weighed nothing. When he set her down, she was laughing and crying at the same time. We should go home, she said, wiping tears from her cheeks. We should, James agreed. But first, he pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. I want to show you what I've been working on. Plans for expanding the cabin, building that studio, maybe adding a small barn for the horses we are going to raise. Ruth looked at the careful sketches, recognizing James's neat draftsmanship in every line. You drew all this last night? I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about our future, about all the things we could build together. James pointed to a section of the drawing. This is where I thought we could put the workshop. South-facing windows for the best light, enough space for all your supplies, maybe even room for a small printing press if you ever want to make books of your artwork. Ruth felt her throat tighten with emotion. You've thought of everything. I've thought of what would make you happy. What would give you room to grow, to create, to be everything you're meant to be. James folded the papers carefully. The money doesn't matter to me, Ruth. What matters is being able to give you the life you deserve. As they rode back toward the cabin together, Ruth felt the last of her fears fade away. James hadn't chosen her because he lacked other options. He'd chosen her because she was the option he wanted most. And for the first time in her adult life, Ruth Calder believed she might actually deserve the love she'd found. The sun was setting behind the mountains when they reached home, painting the sky in brilliant shades of rose and gold. James dismounted and helped Ruth down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. No more running? He asked softly. Ruth smiled, feeling the weight of her grandmother's ring on her finger like a promise. No more running. We're home, James. Finally home. James kissed her forehead, then pulled her close against his chest. Yes, he murmured into her hair. We are. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Ruth thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a dusty auction platform to a mountain stream where promises were made and futures decided. She'd gone looking for hired help and found her heart. James had been sold to pay debts that weren't his, and discovered the love he'd stopped believing in. Sometimes the best things in life came not when you were looking for them, but when you were brave enough to believe you deserved them. And sometimes, Ruth thought as James's arms tightened around her, the heart knew what it needed long before the mind caught up. They were within sight of Ruth's cabin when James suddenly reined in his horse, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. Ruth followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold. Smoke was rising from her chimney, but they'd banked the fire carefully before leaving that morning. And it should have been nothing but cold ashes by now. Someone's in the cabin, James said quietly. Ruth's mind raced through possibilities. Martha had ridden directly to find her, so it wasn't a neighbor seeking help. Marshal Hayes had been heading back to Denver when they'd left him. That left only one logical conclusion, and it made Ruth's stomach drop. Buck Morrison's men, she whispered. But the marshal said he was arrested. Maybe the marshal was wrong. Or maybe Buck has friends who don't care that he's in jail. James studied the cabin, noting the horses tied near the lean-to. 3 horses, same number as before. Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They're waiting for us, or they're looking for something. James's expression hardened. Ruth, I want you to ride back to Martha's place. Get the sheriff? Absolutely not. Ruth's voice cut like steel. That's my home, James. I'm not running away again. This isn't about running away. This is about staying alive long enough to have a future together. Ruth met his eyes. And James saw the same stubborn determination that had made her step out from behind the woodshed with her rifle raised. "We do this together," she said simply. "That's what partners do." James stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Together. But we do it smart." They dismounted and tied their horses well back from the cabin, then made their way through the familiar forest paths Ruth had used since childhood. The terrain gave them every advantage. They knew every tree, every rock, every sight line that would give them a clear shot while keeping them protected. As they crept closer, they could hear voices from inside the cabin. Ruth's jaw tightened when she recognized Buck Morrison's voice, rough with anger and frustration. "Told you he'd have to come back sometime. Ben doesn't just walk away from a setup like this. Maybe he ran when he heard you were looking for him," another voice suggested. "Morrison ain't the running type. Besides, where's he gonna go? That woman bought him fair and square. He's got to honor the contract." Ruth and James exchanged glances. The men inside didn't know about the marshal's visit, didn't know that James's situation had changed completely. They were still operating under the assumption that he was bound to work off his debts. James pointed toward the back of the cabin, indicating they should circle around to get a better view through the kitchen window. Ruth nodded and followed him, stepping carefully to avoid the loose stones that might give away their position. Through the window, they could see Buck Morrison pacing Ruth's kitchen like a caged animal. He was thinner than when they'd last seen him, with the desperate look of a man whose plans had been falling apart for too long. The other two men sat at Ruth's table, one cleaning his fingernails with a knife while the other rifled through her personal belongings. Ruth's hands clenched when she saw the man casually examining her sketches, holding up drawings that represented hours of careful work and personal memories. When he laughed at something he saw and showed it to his companion, Ruth felt rage flare hot in her chest. "Easy," James whispered, sensing her anger. "We need to be smart about this." Through the window, they could hear Buck talking as he paced. "When Morrison gets back, we're going to have ourselves a little conversation about loyalty and consequences. Man kills my cousin, he pays for it. Don't matter what some badge-wearing fool says about self-defense. What about the woman?" one of his companions asked. Buck's smile was cold. "Woman who thinks she can threaten Buck Morrison with a rifle needs to learn some manners. I figure we'll teach her a few things about respect before we're done here." James's face went deadly still. Ruth saw something shift in his expression, something that reminded her of the man who'd stood proud on the auction platform despite his circumstances, someone who'd reached his limit and wouldn't be pushed any further. He pulled out his pocket watch, the one that had belonged to his father, and looked at it for a long moment. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he removed his wedding ring, the simple gold band he'd continued wearing even after he'd stopped writing letters to Sarah. Ruth watched as James dug a small hole in the soft earth beside a young pine tree and buried both the watch and the ring, covering them with stones and dirt. When he looked up at her, his eyes held a resolution that took her breath away. "James," she whispered. "I'm done carrying the past," he said quietly. "Done letting other people's choices define my life. That man in there threatened you, Ruth. Threatened to hurt you because of something I did." James checked his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. "I won't let that happen." Ruth felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "What are you planning?" James met her eyes, and Ruth saw the man he'd been before grief had broken him, strong, determined, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to protecting what he loved. "I'm planning to end this," he said simply. Once and for all. James's plan was simple and direct. Born from years of military experience, Ruth was only now beginning to understand. They would give Buck Morrison and his men exactly what they were waiting for, James Morrison returning home. But they would do it on their own terms. Ruth positioned herself in the hayloft of the lean-to, her rifle trained on the cabin's front door. From her vantage point, she could see anyone who tried to leave, and had a clear shot at the windows if needed. James would approach openly, drawing the men's attention, and hopefully drawing them outside, where the confrontation could happen away from Ruth's belongings. "Remember," James said as they took their positions, No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, wait for my signal before you shoot. These men are dangerous, but they're also desperate. Desperate men make mistakes, Ruth nodded, though her heart was racing so fast she wondered if James could hear it. What if something goes wrong? What if... James reached up and touched her hand where it gripped the rifle. Nothing's gonna go wrong. We know this ground, Ruth. We know each other. Trust that. He kissed her quickly, fiercely, then disappeared into the trees. Ruth watched through the rifle scope as James emerged from the forest, walking toward the cabin with the unhurried stride of a man coming home after a long day. He'd holstered his sidearm and carried his rifle casually, as if he had no idea anyone was waiting for him. The front door of the cabin opened before James had crossed half the clearing. Buck Morrison stepped out onto the porch, flanked by his two companions. All three men were armed, their weapons drawn but not quite pointed at James. "Well, well," Buck called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "If it ain't James Morrison. We've been waiting for you." James stopped about 20 feet from the porch, close enough to talk, but far enough away to have room to maneuver. "Buck, heard you were supposed to be in jail," Buck laughed, a sound without humor. "Turns out I got friends who don't think much of territorial justice. Amazing what a little money in the right hands can accomplish. What do you want, Buck?" "Justice for my cousin. Tom Bradley didn't deserve to die for making a few poor choices." James's voice was steady, controlled. "Tom Bradley was stealing from me while my wife was dying. He drew first when I called him on it. Every witness in that saloon will testify to that. Witnesses can be wrong. Besides, seems to me you've been living pretty comfortable up here while Tom's been rotting in the ground." Ruth watched through her scope as James shifted slightly, his stance becoming more balanced, more ready. "Tom's not in the ground, Buck. He's alive and recovering in Denver. Has been for 2 years. The words hit Buck like a physical blow. Ruth saw him stagger slightly, his face going white with shock and rage. "You're lying, am I? Why don't you ride down to Denver and see for yourself? Tom Bradley is alive, Buck. He's also cleared my name completely and turned over evidence that proves he was being blackmailed into the whole scheme." Buck's face twisted with fury. "I don't believe you. Even if it's true, you still shot him. You still tried to kill him, and if I had to do it again, I would." James's voice carried absolute conviction. "Because a man protects what's his. Just like I'm going to protect what's mine now." "The woman?" Buck sneered. "That mountain witch who thinks she can threaten her betters?" James's hands tightened on his rifle. "That woman has a name. Ruth Calder. And she's going to be my wife." "Well, ain't that sweet?" Buck raised his pistol, no longer pretending this was just a conversation. "Maybe I'll let you watch while I teach her some manners, before I kill you both." Ruth saw James tense, saw the subtle shift in his posture that meant he was about to move. But before he could act, one of Buck's men made a fatal mistake. He turned slightly to look toward the lean-to, his attention drawn by some small sound. That moment of divided attention was all James needed. He dove sideways, rolling behind a woodpile as Buck's first shot went wide. The other two men opened fire, their shots splintering wood and sending up puffs of dust where James had been standing. Ruth had her shot now, Buck Morrison silhouetted clearly in her scope. His attention focused on where James had taken cover. She drew in a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took Buck in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying. He dropped to his knees on the porch, clutching his wounded arm and screaming curses. The remaining two men spun toward the lean-to, trying to locate the source of the shot, and James rose from behind the woodpile like an avenging angel. His rifle spoke twice, precise and deadly, and both men fell. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by Buck Morrison's labored breathing and the distant sound of wind through the pine trees. James approached the wounded man cautiously, his rifle still ready. Buck looked up at him with eyes full of pain and defeat. "This ain't over, Morrison. I got more friends." "No, you don't." James's voice was calm, final. "Your friends are smart enough to know when a war is over. You lost, Buck. Go home. Take what's left of your life and try to make something decent out of it." Ruth climbed down from the hayloft and crossed the clearing to stand beside James. Together, they watched as Buck Morrison struggled to his feet and stumbled toward his horse. "Broken and beaten. Think he'll try again?" Ruth asked quietly. James put his arm around her shoulders. "No, men like Buck only fight when they think they can win. He knows now that he can't." Ruth leaned into James's warmth, finally allowing herself to believe that they were safe. "Is it really over?" "It's really over," James confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We're free, Ruth, both of us. Finally, free." 6 months later, Ruth stood on the porch of her cabin, their cabin now, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. Spring had come again to the high country, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the satisfaction of dreams taking root. The cabin had grown since that confrontation with Buck Morrison. James had used part of his recovered fortune to add a proper bedroom, expand the kitchen, and build Ruth the art studio he'd promised. A bright, airy space with large windows facing south where she could work on her sketches and paintings during the long winter months. But more than the physical changes, Ruth marveled at how completely their lives had transformed. Where once she'd lived in careful solitude, now she shared her days with someone who understood both her need for independence and her capacity for deep, abiding love. James appeared beside her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and moving with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. The haunted look that had marked his features when she'd first seen him on the auction platform was gone, replaced by the contentment of someone who'd learned to balance memory with hope. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. Handing her a cup, Ruth smiled, accepting the coffee and leaning against his solid warmth. "Just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing here planning a wedding, I'd have laughed in their face. And now I can't imagine any other life." Ruth turned to look at him, still amazed by the love she saw reflected in his dark eyes. "Are you nervous?" "About today, I mean?" James considered the question seriously. "A little. Not about marrying you. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. But about whether we're doing justice to what this means. Today was their wedding day. They'd chosen to have the ceremony here on their land, with Martha as matron of honor and the local preacher presiding. It would be small, simple, and perfect, exactly what both of them wanted. "James," Ruth said softly, "Sarah would approve, wouldn't she?" The question that would have devastated him months ago now brought only a gentle sadness, mixed with gratitude. "She would. Sarah always said that love wasn't something to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, multiplied, passed on. She'd want me to be happy, Ruth. She'd want us both to be happy." Ruth set down her coffee cup and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I have something for you. A wedding gift." James opened it carefully and found himself staring at a leather-bound book filled with Ruth's artwork. But these weren't her usual landscape sketches. These were portraits of him, drawn over the months they'd been together. James working at the forge he'd built behind the cabin. James reading by firelight. James laughing at something she'd said. James sleeping peacefully, finally free from the nightmares that had once plagued him. "Ruth," he breathed. "These are beautiful. They're us," she said simply. "Our story from the beginning. I wanted you to see yourself the way I see you, not as a broken man who needed fixing, but as someone who was always whole, someone who just needed the right place to heal." James pulled her close, emotion making his voice rough. "I have something for you too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden sign, carefully carved and polished. On it, in elegant script, were the words, "The Calder Morrison Ranch." "I thought if you were agreeable, we might hang this by the gate. Let everyone know that this is our place, built together." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "Calder Morrison, equal partners in everything," James confirmed. "That's what we are, isn't it? What we've always been?" Ruth stood on her toes and kissed him, tasting the future in the sweetness of his lips. "Always." The wedding ceremony took place in the meadow behind the cabin, with wildflowers serving as decoration and the soaring peaks providing a cathedral more magnificent than any building could offer. Martha cried through the entire service, and even the usually stern preacher seemed moved by the obvious love between the bride and groom, when James and Ruth exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises, to stand together through whatever storms might come, to honor each other's independence while building a shared life, to remember that love was both a gift and a choice they made new each day. There wasn't a dry eye among their small gathering of friends and neighbors. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Ruth and James sat together on their porch, wedding rings gleaming on their fingers. The simple gold bands had been forged by James himself, using metal from his grandfather's old tools and techniques passed down through generations. "Do you think we'll be happy?" Ruth asked, her head resting on James's shoulder. "I think we already are," James replied, his arm tightening around her. "Everything else is just details." Ruth pulled out a new journal, its pages blank and waiting for the stories they'd write together. On the first page, she'd already begun a sketch, two figures standing together on a mountain porch, looking out over a valley that held infinite possibility. "What are you going to write?" James asked, watching as she opened the journal to a fresh page. Ruth smiled and picked up her pen. In careful script, she wrote, "Today I married my best friend, my partner, and the love I never dared hope for. This is where our real story begins." James read over her shoulder and pressed a kiss to her temple. "I like the sound of that." Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called to its mate. Ruth and James sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed their love story, protected by the strength they'd found in each other, and blessed by the understanding that sometimes the best things in life come not when we're looking for them, but when we're brave enough to believe we deserve them. The mountain woman had found her cowboy. The cowboy had found his home, and together they'd found a love strong enough to weather any storm the future might bring.